my friend Greg, who works for BC Timber Sales, he often says that people need to feel a tree, they need to touch a tree. So that's why something like Big Lonely Doug, which is growing in a clear cut, is such a beacon for people. And that book I mentioned, Harley Restad's book, he describes it as an obelisk in a desert. And I feel like that is a useful way of looking at these trees, because they really do stand out and they become markers of the mind as much as anything. It's a marker of what was. Like, we can look around and imagine the landscape with much more bigger trees. And I think it's a marker of what could be. So the big trees feel to me like a portal between times.
Hey folks, what's happening? Welcome to Your Forest. My name is Matthew Kristoff, and on this podcast, we talk about the environment and the science of sustainability. Today, we're talking big old trees. Who doesn't like big old trees, right? I mean, as Amanda says in this episode, you'd have to be some kind of monster. So, yeah, I was fortunate enough to read a really fascinating book called Tracking Giants. Big Trees, Tiny Triumphs, and Misadventures in the Forest. And the book was written by Amanda Lewis, our guest today. She makes her living as a book editor and writer and obviously an author. And she came on the show to tell us about her story of, you know, she left her life as a stressed out book editor in Toronto and came back to the West Coast and fell back in love with the forest and big trees and wanted to take on a big task. And so she figured big trees are the one. She's going to write about them. And she learned all kinds of things along the way. She did such an incredible job of balancing all the values and balancing all the perspectives and coming out with a fair and even and really emotionally involved and emotionally connected book. It was just such a great read, and I had such an excellent conversation with her. And I've never really talked big trees. We talk forest management, but we've never specifically focused on big old trees, right? So that's what today's all about. Big old trees with Amanda Lewis. Maybe that's what I should have called it instead of Tracking Giants. Maybe, we'll see. Sponsors for this episode. West Fraser is the number one sponsor for 2023, and they have been for a while. Without West Fraser, I would not be able to record and edit and produce this podcast the way I want to do it. They let me do whatever I want, and I am so very grateful. Thank you, West Fraser, for your support. And Greenlink Forestry is the other sponsor. They have been with me since the beginning. Again, I couldn't do this without them. Thank you, Greenlink. So yeah, without any further messing around, let's dive into this discussion around big old trees, what they mean to us as people, as emotional beings, how we can start to think about them differently and start to connect to them and what they mean to our society. Here we go. First of all, I really loved the book. It was immediately very fun. Immediately very very transparent and like honest. You're just like it feels like you're writing like your brain works, which was cool.
Yeah,
I really enjoyed that. And you know, it's actually been for quite a while. I've been thinking about I would like to have somebody on who has like a deep passion for and love of nature, but is not like a scientist or a forester, or is directly like their income and all that stuff is directly tied to and so I wanted to have someone on who like yourself, right? And so I was really excited to be able to read your book and especially on this topic of tracking big, huge old trees, right? Because there's such a emotional connection and such a driving force behind a lot of the popular culture and that kind of thing, right? So, I love the book, first of all.
Well,
and
thanks.
Before we get into the specific book, I think we need to just like dive into yourself a little bit. And I'd like to know, like, what's your deal? How did this happen? If you were to just like explain yourself to people and how you came here. How'd you go about doing that?
How it came to be this certain collection of molecules.
Yes, exactly. I love it.
So the long story is I was born on a summer day. I was born in Ireland, and I moved to Canada when I was 4 and grew up in Surrey, which is outside of Vancouver in BC. Mm-hmm. And I really loved this West Coast landscape where I live now. And it was just a really, really big part of my life as a kid. It was like playing in the forest. And so much so that when I went to university, I didn't want to leave the coast. I decided to stay, and I went to UBC. And I really fell in love with books and publishing and editing, and the way to get a job in publishing at that time, and still to an extent, but it's different now a bit, but was to go to Toronto and get a job. So I moved out to Toronto to work in book publishing and ended up staying there for 8.5 years, and was really, really homesick that whole time for this landscape. And I did well in my career. Like I was working for the biggest publisher, Penguin Random House, and really had great mentors. But I just started to realize, no, something's got to give. Like, am I always just going to live here in downtown Toronto? And I had a good life there and everything. But the turning point for me was, I remember it was kind of February, March, which, you might know this from Edmonton, but definitely in Toronto, it's like the winter seems interminable, and
Yeah.
people are crunching along on the salty sidewalks. And I'm like, oh my God, it's never going to end. Yeah. And I had this dream that I was walking along a forest path, and I could hear the fir cones under my feet, and I could hear an eagle, and I could hear the surf crashing, and I could just see these big trees. And then I woke up like in a cold sweat, and I thought, okay, like now I really just need to get back there. And so I decided to give notice on my apartment and move back to the West Coast. And that kind of big life decision is super hard on you. Like it takes a lot of mental energy to just say no to one part of your life and move back. So I was already pretty burned out from my career and this constant questing I had to get ahead, and in an industry that's pretty it's hard to support yourself in. Like, you don't get paid that much, and the hours are long, and there's a lot of emotional, intellectual labor. So I was feeling pretty burned out from that. And just with the move across the country, I felt just super burned out. And then I immediately started up with this new job that was also intense in publishing, and just was really feeling tapped. And I remember sitting on my couch for most of that fall, like watching Downton Abbey, and like really trying to just settle and make friends, like reconnect with old friends. But everything shifts. And that spring, I started to get out more hiking in the North Shore Mountains, which are just a short drive from Vancouver, and started going on these little day hikes. And I'd always loved day hiking, but I'd never done an overnight hike or a backpack. Like, car camping for sure. Yeah. Like, I'm all about it. Canadian tradition. But I thought, I'm starting to feel more like myself because I was back in this landscape that I love so much. But being an editor, I wanted to put a frame on it. And my 1-year anniversary was coming up, being back on the coast. And I thought, maybe I'll start a blog where I can capture some of these outdoor adventures and like little day trips, because I'm not a typical adventurer. Like, maybe that will be interesting to people. And I mentioned this idea to my friend Kate Harris, and she's an adventurer and author. And we met when I worked on her book, Lands of Lost Borders, which is a travel memoir about cycling from Istanbul to India. So she's like a hardcore adventurer. I said, what do you think about this blog idea? And she's like, not great. Like, I don't love the idea. But she just read this book called Big Lonely Doug by Harley Rustad. And that book is about the 66-meter Douglas fir that grows near Port Renfrew on Vancouver Island. And it's included on this thing called the BC Big Tree Registry, which is a database of the biggest known trees in BC. And she read about that in the book, and she'd read specifically about this thing called champion trees. And the champion trees are the biggest of their species. And I'd never heard of them And she said, why don't you just, this is over text, by the way. She's like, why don't you go visit all the champion trees? And I said, yeah, okay, that seems totally doable for a book editor in Vancouver. And I committed to it on the spot and started a blog the next day called Tracking Giants.
Nice.
Yeah.
That sounds like, yeah, I was going to ask you that. I was like, well, what was the motivation for the book? You're like, my friend told me to do it.
Yeah. She's like, I've got an idea for you.
Yeah. It wasn't this emotional, like, you didn't walk up to this big tree and just like felt totally captured and enthralled by it and wanted to like, tell its story. You're just like, yeah, my friend told me.
My friend told me. And I was just looking for some big goal, right?
Yeah. You're looking for something that's important to you. So
yes.
Yeah, absolutely. And who doesn't love big trees, right?
Yeah. Like I mean, you got to be some kind of monster.
Yeah, exactly. Precisely. So I wanted to ask you, when it comes to writing, like what is writing to you? What is the ultimate goal in writing anything, let alone this book?
The first answer that popped to my mind was writing is such a pain in the ass. But
writing, I like it.
Writing is, it's, I think, one of the most difficult and most rewarding things. So I work as a book editor and I've been doing this for a long time. And most people think they have a book in them. And I often say like, well, actually 100% of people have a spooky skeleton inside of them. Like not everyone has a book. And that's okay. And why would you want to write a book anyway? Because it's so hard and is just an immense use of time. But the reason I work in publishing and editing is I think that books are still one of the last ways to reward deep thought. And we're so distracted these days with, the latest flashy Netflix show or whatever. And, I'm a diehard John Wick fan too, I should say. Like, I like TV. I was watching John Wick last night while doing some file management, right? It's all good. But the thing with writing is it's just a way to reach one person. And I think there's something so pure and crystalline about having truly effective communication. And that for me is like this holy grail of writing where you're like, if I could just keep refining it, then it might land with the person. Yeah.
Yeah. I don't know. I get that. Like I get the idea that it's like you're trying to write something true, like truly true and transparent somehow. And trying to reach some truth that was otherwise not clear to someone maybe. Yeah. Like I don't know. I'm not a writer. Like I'm grammatically not good.
Yeah, that's okay. There are programs for that.
Yeah, exactly. Right.
Yeah.
The part of the problem, I blame French immersion for screwing up where my E's go.
Right. But, yes.
Yeah. My wife always gives me trouble with that. She's just like, we put E's on the end of everything. I'm like, I'm sorry.
It's my schooling. Yeah.
Oh man. And, but yeah, I do find I have a deep appreciation for well put together sentences, right? Like a good, maybe not just the written word, but the spoken word that is very well just put together in a very specific way and almost like a scientific paper, and that every word has a very specific purpose for being there. If you took any word out, it would mean something entirely different. And just like the power of words is fascinating to me. And yeah, so I have a deep appreciation for that, but I like to ask writers like, what is it to you? What are you trying to do? Like, what's the,
Yeah. And when you said about the power of words, like with a scientific paper or that, when you're writing to a certain limit, like in a scientific paper, I think that constraint is a wonderful thing. Or like the best copywriting, like when you see an advertisement that's so smart and sharp and you're like, yes, that is a great use of words. I mean, not the end goal is capitalism, but like you can appreciate it for what it is. But like my goal with this book was to really reach people who are like me or who feel maybe fearful of the forest or feel that they don't deserve to be there. Because they don't have the knowledge. And that was really my base when I started out, was I knew a little bit about trees and certainly liked trees and had looked at it from the angle of environmentalism and that side, but didn't know, like, I didn't really know what I was getting into.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, no, that makes sense. I had heard of the Big Tree Registry before, but that's it. I knew
Yeah.
nothing about it. I didn't know about the champ. I assumed there was someone was keeping score out there, right? Like,
Somebody, yeah.
Whether or not I wasn't really sure though. So, I definitely learned a lot from reading the book about, the inner workings of that. And you had great dialogue on some of the inner conflicts about some of the ideas and stuff. Like it was really enjoyable. And it stepped me outside of my own boreal universe as well, right? So that was great because I know very little about the coast, if I'm honest. Like I'm a forester, but if I came to the coast, I know as much as you do. Like I don't.
Yes.
I'm not someone that anyone should be listening to in that regard.
Right.
So I really enjoyed it in that way. So. Let's shine a little light on the Big Tree Registry. So your friend tells you, hey, there's this Big Tree Registry, there's champion trees. Yeah. That sounds really cool. What's a champion tree? Okay, the biggest tree of their species in BC. Mm-hmm. How many trees are on the Big Tree Registry? How many champions are there?
Yeah.
And when you started to look into this, how overwhelming did this task become?
Yeah, so the BC Big Tree Registry is an online database of trees, and there are hundreds of trees in the registry. And to be in the registry, you have to be a native tree. So we'll just say that. So it's not all trees. Right. And then you could just say like all of BC is on the registry, but native trees. And they are trees that are people will just notice. Like a lot of them are found by foresters, or someone is staring at that big apple tree, or not apple tree, but like a Gary oak in their backyard and thinking that's pretty big. Like I wonder how big it is. And the trees are recorded in the registry with a tree score. And the way the tree score comes, it's a combination of points that comes from measuring the diameter of the tree and the height and the crown. And as we'll probably
I didn't realize that.
Yeah.
I didn't realize that it's literally like a trophy hunting thing.
It is literally like trophy hunting. Yeah.
Yeah, for those that don't know, like I am a hunter, and I have scored animals that I've out of curiosity that I've hunted. And yeah, that's what you do. You take all the measurements and you add it all up, and it makes this score. And if you get above a certain score, you get into the record books, and it's this big deal, right? And I didn't realize that is fascinating, because I would have thought the Big Tree people, like that community, the granola people. I'll just say that because it's a fun way of
hey, Alberta, right? What's up?
We got to throw it out there, right? Like it's. I would have thought they would have just wanted to stay away from that idea, right? Because it's kind of like it's kind of an icky idea to like, I'm going to put this quantifiable score on something that's alive. Yeah.
Exactly. I think it's a little icky myself, but it is just a sorting mechanism like anything else. And there's a different tree ranking system used in the States. And I should say that the BC Big Tree Registry is not unique. So the idea for the registry, I'll just zoom out a bit.
Sure.
The idea for the BC Big Tree Registry came from this guy named Randy Stoltmann, who is a famed BC Big Tree tracker. And he's like really held up as the guy, in BC. Yeah. And he grew up in the North Shore Mountains and would wander around cataloging these big trees in the West Van and the North Shore and on the island, on Vancouver Island. And he thought, okay, so I've got all these records of trees, and it'd be cool to start our own BC Big Tree Registry, because in a province known for its superlative trees, like we really have some of the biggest and best trees. And so he had that idea, but the idea for registries, I believe, originated in Maryland in the 1920s. And it was a forester, the chief forester, came up with this idea because Maryland was also logging out some of its biggest trees at the time. And he thought we should capture what's left. And that's kind of the sad side of tree registries, is they usually come from a goal to capture what's left of what was. And I feel that if we really looked at registries and why they exist, the purpose of them should really be to become obsolete in and of themselves. Because if we just saved the big trees, we wouldn't need to catalog them. But be that as it may, Randy Stoltmann had this idea, and he had banker's boxes full of photos and drawings and maps of these trees. And he released this wonderful book, which is still the definitive guide to BC, called, I might get the title slightly wrong, but it's like the hiking guide to the big trees of BC. Okay. And it's the book that a lot of BC Big Tree trackers still use, but
Right
the
on.
thing about trees is they are mortal and they die and they grow bigger than this other tree over here and they lose limbs, and the waymarking points, like a sandbar, might have moved in the decades since Stoltmann released that map. So it's an old resource. Randy Stoltmann died in his early 30s, tragically, in a mountaineering accident. And after the confusion over that early death, a lot of the records just were kind of lost. But eventually, there was a push to reanimate this BC Big Tree Registry, and it was digitized, I believe, in 2014 at UBC's Faculty of Forestry. And before that, the records had kind of been passed around between government agencies. But once it was digitized, that's when it was like kind of reborn. And that's when I came into it, was in 2018. And I came to know trees and the registry really as an Excel spreadsheet.
Right. Yeah, of course. Yeah.
Yeah. The thing about this spreadsheet is it's like this artificial way to look at trees, and it was all just numbers, and I'm not a numbers person at all. But as we talked about with Tree Score, is it ranks the trees according to the score, and you can see what is the biggest arbutus or the biggest this or the biggest that. And the champions are the biggest of their species, as I mentioned. At the time, there were 43 champion trees. Last time I checked the registry, there were about 54, but that number is always going to fluctuate as trees are found or as they die. Yeah. And I thought, 43 trees, 52 weeks, let's go. Like, I'm an overachiever. Yeah. I can find these trees. I can take some time off, for holidays, and most of them seem to grow around my home in Vancouver, but really they grow all over the province in totally different types of terrain.
Yeah. No, it is fascinating. So getting deeper into it, what do you think it is exactly? Like, if you had to put it into words, that makes big old trees so magnetic, you know what I mean? Like, they seem to pull people into their grandeur, right? Like, what is it that's so spectacular about big trees, and what is their importance to society, do you think?
Well, so there's a bunch of answers to that, but I think the immediate thing for me is with these big trees and why they are such a pull is they are some of the oldest things on the coast, like oldest living things on the coast. And on the coast specifically, and I should say not all big trees are old and not all old trees are big. But I'm thinking about the biggest trees, which would be like your Sitka spruce, Douglas fir, cedars, yellow and western red cedar. They tend to get pretty big. And I think they draw us in because they represent that deeper time and that slower way of being. And something I came to realize over the course of the project is that trees really just grow for themselves, and they grow with others, and they're not just doing it for the sake of getting bigger, and they're not like competing, and they tend to grow big together. So you'll often find a lot of big trees in one big grow patch, like one big grow site. And that was really interesting to me when I realized that, because I had originally put all this pressure on trees as a way to answer my own questions about my life, because I was going through this burnout and trying to re-establish myself on the coast, and thought like, oh, surely when I stand in front of a big tree, I can just ask my questions and I'll get all my answers and everything will make sense. And that wasn't my experience when I first found these trees, because they aren't all big and they aren't all grandiose or even beautiful by any standard.
Sure.
And yeah. So I was just like, is this a champion? Like, what is the point of this project? And it really became more about like life. Like, what am I doing? It's turning this big existential thing. But I think that the people really want to be in touch with these trees. And my friend Greg, who works for BC Timber Sales, he often says that people need to feel a tree, they need to touch a tree. So that's why something like Big Lonely Doug, which is growing in a clear cut, is such a beacon for people. And that book I mentioned, Harley Rustad's book, he describes it as an obelisk in a desert. And I feel like that is a useful way of looking at these trees because they really do stand out and they become markers of the mind as much as anything.
Yep.
Or if you think about a big grove or a small grove of big trees on Vancouver Island called Cathedral Grove, it's very well visited because it's right on the highway. And that's also a great thing for people because they can experience these big trees, and it's a marker of what was. Like, we can look around and imagine the landscape with much more bigger trees.
Yeah.
And I think it's a marker of what could be. So the big trees feel to me like a portal between times.
Yeah. I love that. Yeah. Yeah. The two quotes that I loved in the book, and I'm not even sure 100% that it was you or if it was you quoting somebody else, but I'll say them and you can tell me.
Yeah.
They summed up the idea of big trees and their importance so well. Was big trees upset the temporal scale. And I was like, they upset the temporal scale. So yeah, like you were saying, they bring you back. They make you wonder what was before, colonized Canada became a thing, right? Like what was going on back then. And then also the other one was big trees hold our hope and our guilt. And
yes.
I'm like, yeah, that kind of nails it, right? Like we're like, I hope this doesn't go away. I hope that there's more of this. And also, damn, why isn't there more of this? What have we done? Yeah. Yeah. And so I thought those were excellent. And I found throughout, because clearly you're a person, at least through your writing, it seems, you're a person who's very in touch with the artistic endeavor and trying to explain things in a way in which people can internalize them, based off of like a lot of the people that you quoted in the book. And it was, I found like you did an excellent job of helping me to step into your mind and like your feelings, your emotions in those moments. And I thought that was crucial. And it was in a very posh way, right? Like it was very like approachable. And that's why I think it helped me to understand your journey a little bit more, right? It was great. The idea of like champion trees. Okay. So now the biggest one. Throughout the book, like you discussed some of the controversy, even within the big tree tracking community around having champion trees and naming champion trees and having them be this artifact that people can go and see, like kind of a spectacle, right? And there was some, and there's a lot of debate, it seems like, going back about, okay, is it a net positive or a net negative to be doing all of this? And so I wanted to know your perspective on that. Like, do you think the idea of having a champion tree and naming it and putting the focus on that so that more people go see it and appreciate it, is it worth the risk of, potentially maybe killing that tree from or whatever, or maybe just like there's risks involved with making something a spectacle, right? And you discussed that a lot in the book. So yeah, I wanted to know your internal feelings about it and where you lie. Do you think that it's a net positive to society to be able to point these things out and show them to people, and it's worth the whatever kind of risks might be incurred?
Yeah, I mean, I have a lot of answers milling around about that.
I do too.
Yeah, my feeling is it's almost like using a blue whale as a symbol to then look at the forest, and then you start looking at plankton. Is that you almost need this big thing to draw people in, because people are busy and they're dropping the kids off at soccer and they're trying to submit that thing on time and all of that. And so the trees do stop you in your tracks, especially when you realize like this tree is the size of a bus or whatever is the metric that we're using. But my friend Greg, who I just mentioned, who works for BC Timber Sales, he, as much as he says people need to see these trees and touch them, he also says that people can love a tree to death. And these trees become almost the sacrifice for us, because a tree like Big Lonely Doug, or more accurately like Hyperion. Hyperion is a big redwood in California. And I believe it's the tallest tree in the world, if I'm not mistaken on that one.
As far as I know, it is. Yeah.
Yeah. And for a long time, its location was concealed because people didn't want the tree to be destroyed, which is a really weird thing, because why would you trek through the forest to go destroy something? But the nature of meeting with these trees is you can trample their roots, and people were like pooping and leaving garbage around the tree, and it's like not really respectful. So eventually the park just said, no, it's actually illegal to visit this tree, and you can get fined or you could face jail time for visiting this tree, which is, it's a very strange stance to take on a tree, right? But I think that this is the risk of highlighting and almost idolizing one tree over the whole forest, and they become almost like the poster children of the forest. And in the book, I talk about how like Big Lonely Doug it's a symbol for the conservation movement, the same way that when I was growing up, like a duck soaked in oil was an environmental symbol, or like kids today who probably know about like a turtle with a plastic straw up its nose. Like every generation has its symbol. And I think it does a disservice to the trees to just symbolize them. Like they don't ask for it. They don't ask to be put on a registry, or they don't care if you visit them or measure them. Like it's not really about that. And that's why I wanted to bring in these other metrics of appreciating trees that aren't just the size or the number of them left like in the province. And the idea of naming a tree, it's funny. It's like the tree almost becomes like a pet, you know? And
sure.
I think that is a bit problematic, but it also is a way to connect with that tree. And if you think of it more generously, it's more like a friend, and you find a friend in the forest, and then you start to visit that friend, either literally in the forest or in your mind. And so a lot of these trees do have names, and that's a convention of BC, or sorry, not BC, but big tree trackers in general. They tend to go find and name something. But I find that so colonial, because
sure, for
like
sure.
the trees.
Let me put my stamp on this
totally
thing.
And
my name is in the record books now.
And a funny thing about big tree tracking is it's in the States, a lot of the names are they're named after like generals and Confederate generals, and it makes a lot of people really uncomfortable. So the names of trees have changed a lot over the years, like the same way we're toppling statues now, because we don't want to revere those people. And again, the trees don't ask to be named like General Grant or whatever. And in BC, the trees have like a nautical theme, a lot of them. Right. So like the Admiral. And they're like, they have all these nautical names, and it's just like, it's kind of funny. If you look at it as innocent, it's kind of funny. And then you think about strange names for trees. Most trees are named something like the big tree, the big spruce. But it's problematic because the tree, if you find it and you name it and you own it and you put it in the registry, well, the First Nations who've lived there since time immemorial, they know about that tree, and they've been monitoring the health of that tree most likely, and they might have a name for it. Like the golden spruce had a name, before we called it the golden spruce. And to just go in and stamp a name on it is, I think, really disrespectful. So some of the younger tree trackers just don't name the trees at all. Yeah.
It is interesting. Like I think, like there was a big push against anthropomorphizing things for a while there, right? And I don't think I have an issue with it, as long as it's not like applying features to that thing that don't exist, right? As long as you're not, and so like I think in the end, I'm personally, just for myself, I'm cool with it, because I think like one great point that you brought up from obviously incredible writer Robin Wall Kimmerer, right? Like let's appreciate her and her books for a moment. Like
for sure.
just like groundbreaking and just so eye-opening for a lot of people, right? Myself included. And she made the point in her book that you pointed out in your book, that using certain language around trees, like language of objectivity, right? Calling it takes away a lot of the onus on how you treat that thing, because now it's a thing and you can't really disrespect a thing because it's a thing, right? And so I appreciated that that you pointing that out in the book, right? Like if we use different pronouns, like maybe you don't want to use like he and she, or maybe, but you have something else, some way of recognizing that this is a living thing that has its own agenda about like, you know, how to survive and carry on its progeny and everything else, and to respect it as such, right? And I thought that was a great point, in that trees are part of the ecology, and they are part of the forest, and they are part of the living structure of the land, right? And to treat them as an object rather than something to be respected and revered. Not to say that you can't, you know, utilize them for, I mean, you know, you live in a log house. Like, of course, like there's a certain amount of like but do that in a respectful way in which you're not reducing resources. Do that in a respectful way in which you're giving back as much as you might be taking away in a balanced fashion, right? And yeah, I think it's easy to be like, don't anthropomorphize something, right? It seems like you're taking a high road. You're like, that's not scientific, and you're like, well, I don't know. We're emotional beings, and to pretend that like so if that helps emotional beings connect to something, I'm cool with it. Like I don't personally have an issue, but I mean, who am I?
Well, and it's also a very Western way of looking at the forest, right? Because First Nations might think of a grandmother or a grandfather tree, and that's a point that Robin Wall Kimmerer makes, is that if you have a maple and you call it, it's very easy to cut it down because it's just a thing, as you're saying. But if it's a grandmother, and if it's really part of your family and part of the landscape, and you know that it has a relationship to the trees around it, you wouldn't cut your grandmother down, or like most likely
most of us
you're
wouldn't,
like
no.
Bugsy Malone style. But yeah, and that was a realization I had pretty early on as well with my friend Hiromi Gato, who's a writer who lives out here on the coast, and I was using one of these great guidebooks to trees of Vancouver that were made in like the 90s. And the cool thing about Vancouver is there are arboreta, so like the plural of arboretum, a few of them all around the city. And one of them is in the middle of this neighborhood called Shaughnessy. And Shaughnessy,
can you explain what that is first? What an arboretum is first?
So an arboretum it's almost like a park-like setting, and trees are planted, and it's like a collection of trees, and they're grown for scientific reasons or aesthetic reasons. They used to be grown for woodlot reasons, like you might plant a black walnut or an oak and then plan to harvest it in years to come, or food-bearing trees like nuts. But they originated like many centuries ago. Anyway, the idea has been carried around the world, and now they're mostly for scientific and aesthetic reasons. And they're almost like a living collection. So there are these arboreta around Vancouver, and there's one in this neighborhood called Shaughnessy, and people who know Vancouver will know that Shaughnessy is the place. It's the swankiest, richest place in a city that is like, there's the wealth disparity is vast, and the houses are huge, the lots are huge, and it was designed that way to be a very wealthy neighborhood, that you had to have the money at the time to buy a lot that was like 3 times the size of a regular lot. Like, it's all just bad news bears from the beginning.
Sure.
But anyway, there's a circular park in Shaughnessy, and in that park there's an arboretum. Yeah. And I had no idea. Like, I'd never known about this. And I found this map in this old guidebook, and I said to my friend Hiromi, like, do you want to like grab some hot chocolate? It was in like a really rainy November day. And I was like, well, I'll drive us to this circular park, and we can see how many of these trees still survive. And so we hopped in the car, and I had this map with like little numbers on it, you know, and the number equates to like a Norway spruce, or equates to this type of tree. And I was running around looking for these numbers, and it's like, oh, this tree is gone, this tree is still standing, this tree, I don't know what this tree is, there's a hole here, like just trying to like look at the book and then look at the landscape. And then I hadn't heard from Hiromi in a while, and I look up, and she's just standing in front of a tree saying, who are you? Like, whose child is this? And I thought, this is a way to actually learn from the forest, is really to recognize these trees as beings. And I'm doing it kind of going about it all wrong here.
Yeah.
I
think like we're also beings that like to quantify things. It helps us put things into boxes so that we can place them on the shelf and then organize them in a way that allows us to make sense of the whole system, the whole structure, right?
Yeah.
So I think in the same way, right? Like as in the way that I agree, like I think, for example, I'm a forester, right? Like I grew up, both my parents were foresters. And I grew up edging up against the boreal forest. I spent literally my entire childhood, except when I was at school or hockey. I'm Canadian, so hockey, of course.
Yeah.
I was outside. I got home from school and I went and built a fort, or I went and did X, Y, and Z or whatever, right? And I was always outside. And it wasn't until as you start to get into forestry school, into the university, then you start looking at them. Yeah, it's more like, okay, understand this list, like learn the Latin names, and now you have to memorize, how to do volume calculations, and now you have to do, and you start to get, and I get it, it's an industry, so you have to understand these things, but yeah, like slowly over time, you do start to kind of get desensitized, I would think, to, and it takes a conscious effort, and you still love trees, you still appreciate them, right? One thing I always say is foresters didn't get into this because they love 2x4s, right?
That's right.
Most of them got into it, if in fact probably nearly all of them got into it because they love forests and want to see them exist and perpetuate throughout time. But I will say that there is a bit of a shift when you're surrounded by foresters and you're surrounded by one kind of perspective. It's possible to lose sight of other values and unintentionally start managing forest for, uninclusively. Right. So I think it's totally, I think it's crucial that especially the folks who are out there every day managing forests, they need to be trying to step outside their comfort zone a little bit and just just sit down and try to be mindful about the forest a little bit and try to enjoy it and try and just be a little kid again and just be wowed by it. Right.
Totally.
Like absolutely. Like I think that changes, it just changes the way we think about it in a huge way. And I think that was a big reason why I loved your book so much, is because it was very much, you brought in the quantification because you're obviously tracking giants. That's the name of the book, right? But you always tied it back to the emotion and the personal connection. And because again, we're emotional beings, right? We like to quantify so we can understand, but emotion in the end is what drives us. So yeah, and I'm really glad you raised that point too about people who work in the woods. Like they work there because they love it, and I think that's something that was definitely the opposite was pushed a lot when I was really part of the environmental activist conservation movement. Oh, sure. Yeah. And that like loggers are bad and you're either for the forest or you're against it. And that's so polarizing and just not true. Like people love working in the woods, and you can't just feel your way into a tree. Like you have to live for and by the forest, and you do need to quantify it a certain way. And have know the tree's volume and understand if it's worth cutting down or not. I mean, First Nations have done this too for years, that they have emotional or even mythical relationships with trees, but they're also harvesting trees and use scientific methods of test holes and ways of testing like the density of a tree. Is it going to make a good canoe or not? But it was important for me to highlight that we are emotional creatures, and we can have those relationships to the woods, even if we do work in the woods. And you don't have to be constantly overwhelmed with feelings in the forest and think like this being and this tree and who are you? Like as a forester, it would take forever to get through your day. But to think about the interconnectivity of the forest and think, if I cut this tree down, is that going to have ramifications for things around it? Absolutely. Yeah, no, absolutely. I think, and I think it was evident in your book as well that as you started, you were kind of like, okay, my friend told me I should track giants. I'm going to do that. And you were like, that was your goal. I'm going to do this. I got 52 weeks to get 43 trees and no problem. Let's do this. And as time goes on, recognizing the importance of, you're missing the forest for the tree, and you started to learn, you started to appreciate the ecology of it a little bit more, and the interactions and the interconnectivity, right? And we have to, I think the idea of sustainability, right? It's a pretty new idea, right? And it's only a few decades old, really, and like the word sustainability anyways, right? And so when we start to think about that, we realize that we've only really started to put a dent in what that means and how that, and to me, it's a tapestry, right?
Mm-hmm.
If the forest is a tapestry of values and inputs and outputs, and by removing one thread, the whole thing starts to come undone, right? So we need to be thinking about all of these things at once in order to, and we can't be assuming things, right? In order for it to be done properly. And so yeah, it's important to quantify, but it's important to also hedge your bets and go, okay, maybe let's assume that I don't maybe know everything about something. And I really appreciate balanced perspectives, people who are just representing, that like to show both. And I like that about the book. It just helped me to understand, at least in your headspace around these ideas, right? Around big trees and where we sit and how we should contemplate them.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Thank you. And that's what's exciting about the registry is it is democratic in that anyone can nominate a tree to it.
Mm-hmm.
And citizen scientists, or I think the preferred term these days is community scientists, can find this tree and say, is this worth noting? And I think this is the biggest, but does that matter? Or like what, or is, I often joke in my house, like, what is bigness? Like, what does that really mean? And that a forest technologist or a forester would need to verify those measurements, but it really is something that everyone can engage in. And then you start to think beyond the registry, like you don't have to nominate it for it to be significant. That little tree, like I planted a couple of conifers in my backyard, and they're super small, right? But they're significant to me because I'm like, I raised you from a sapling. And that's the thing about trees is they don't have to be any one way for us to appreciate them or value them. And that was a big realization I had around this idea of the interconnectivity. As you said about sustainability, like the term is pretty new. And the concept, of course, has been around forever. But this idea of sustainability of a life is pretty key to me because of going through the burnout and because of the work I do. So I often work with people who are struggling to fit creative aspects into their life, like writing a book, for example. And I often say, like, writing needs to feel possible and you have to sustain your own creative life. And so what would that look like for you? And usually it means turning down the pressure of that thing. And that was my actual way into finding these trees. It's like, have you ever read The Snow Leopard by Peter Matheson?
I haven't, but I know of it. Yeah.
So the premise of that is he goes out to I think it's the Himalayas to find this elusive snow leopard, and he's tracking this animal that very few people have seen. And he's obsessed with this quest to find the snow leopard. And then he realizes, it's not about that. Like, it's not about the snow leopard, and the snow leopard is probably watching him this whole time. And and
almost definitely,
and he's like, if I'm worthy of seeing the snow leopard, I will. And it becomes this big Buddhist parable, right? But that's the thing about trees is once you stop looking for them, they start to reveal themselves. It's like in the coast here, the coastal forests, it's very typical. You'll see hemlock, cedar, Douglas fir, and sometimes you'll see a Pacific yew. And a Pacific yew is such a slender tree and is a great example of even though it's old, it's not very big. And it's got this red-blue bark, and it was harvested to like a great extent in the 50s and 60s because it has this chemical called Taxol, which is still an ingredient in chemotherapy, I think specifically for breast cancer. But the thing about the yew is if you go looking for a yew, you're not going to find it. But if you stop looking, you'll suddenly have one in front of you. And I've found so many yews in the past few months, and they're always a treat. And this is the thing about like looking for the biggest and the best in a life, is that you end up missing a lot along the way. And I realized that the source of my burnout was that I was just like trying to hit those mega achievements like career and be promoted to editor and maybe publisher and buy a house and find a mate and all those things. But I was missing out on these basic joys in my life.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, I really enjoyed that I don't know if it was an intentional Buddhist saying, but if you go looking for you, you're not going to find you. I was like, that was good.
Yeah. Or my friend Kate, she says in the book, like, to find the tree, you must become the tree.
Yeah, sure. Let's go with it, right? Yeah. Where would I be if I was a tree? Yeah. That's so funny. Yeah. It's fun to think these things. And I agree. Like I had a thought arose to me when I was reading the book that, like, okay, you're a writer. You come up with this project. You're like, okay, I'm going to write a book about big trees, and you must have expectations on yourself of, I'm going to achieve some kind of transcendence or some kind of personal realization, and I'm going to have this wisdom to share that I can write into this book. And because I feel like that's what I would be doing, right? Like if I was writing a book, I'd be like, okay, if I'm writing a book, there must be a purpose. What is the purpose? Okay, I have to achieve this goal, like these 3 things or whatever. That's what I'm aiming for.
Yeah.
That must be a tremendous amount of pressure, and it must be also incredibly challenging while you're doing the thing for the book that you're going to later write about. You're in your own head thinking, is this the transcendence moment? Is this where do we, and like, I can't imagine how,
always.
Yeah. Like how confusing it must be to be like, wait, am I being true? Am I telling the true story, or am I making shit up right now in my own head?
God.
Like,
yeah.
I could see that. I would struggle with that. So I wanted to ask you about that.
Now, why writers are uniquely neurotic because we're always like, is this a story? Is this a narrative? Am I living my true narrative right now? Yeah. And like I said, the project started as a blog. But a few months into it, I was thinking, this is a book. Because that's the thing about editors, is that we look for books. And I thought, okay, that put a ton of pressure on the project, because I thought, I really have to find these trees. Like, it has to be this book. But how do I write about 43 trees? That seems like a lot of trees to write about. And I'd originally wanted to write something that was like The Golden Spruce by John Valiant, which I think is like the quintessential BC forest book. And I realized, thankfully, that I couldn't write that book because John Valiant is just beyond me in terms of skill, but also I would have to write it 43 times.
Right.
So it didn't make sense.
It's a different book.
Yeah.
Right.
And so the project itself, it started to really morph as like, okay, how am I going to actually tell this story? So the book took me about 3 years of traveling and learning and reading and writing and editing to actually pull it off. And those 3 years were really challenging because I was working this very busy day job, and I would look for trees on the weekends. But as everyone knows who writes a book around their life, is like that weekend is like the prime time to write your book. And so I felt like I could do one thing or the other. And I had all these notes about trees and like little hand-drawn maps, and I wasn't having much success even finding the trees, and I didn't have the time to write about them. So I thought, this project is just dying on the vine. Like, I don't know how this is going to be a book. And I had a contract by then with Greystone, and I thought many times about just writing to them, be like, I can't do it. Like, let's cancel the contract.
It's not working out.
It's not working out. I can't write this book that I really hope to write. And one of the turning points for me was, I had the blog, and I had been diligently going out every weekend and updating it every Sunday or Monday. And I stopped doing that because I was still going out on the weekends and looking for trees, but I wasn't finding anything, and I was just getting more and more frustrated. And my friend Ronnie said, you haven't been writing your blog. And I said, did you stop the project? And I said, no, I'm doing it more than ever. I just haven't been finding these trees. And I don't think it's worthwhile to write about the failure. And she said, no, that's what we're actually interested in. And I thought, oh, okay. So that was a turning point for me with this book. I thought, really, tree tracking it's so much about, like, we use a lot of the hunting metaphors, like you're bagging a tree, you're tracking it, you're hunting it, it's your quarry. But it's actually
scoring it, all that stuff.
Yeah, totally. And then the champions and ranking them, all of that stuff. I realized it's actually like a creative project. And I thought that the tree project was going to turn me into this more adventurous version of myself, where I'd be like rugged, like a tree planter, or like like a tugboat operator. Like I could really just paddle my own canoe kind of thing, like really be sustainable or self-sufficient in the forest. And it wasn't that. It just made me more of myself, which is like an artist in the woods. And when I realized that I was trying to think of the project like a writer and I needed to think of it more like an editor, then I could change the ending, because writers often get stuck on what the ending's going to be. And they think, oh, I've figured it out and now I just need to write towards it. But why is it so difficult? And it's because they need to shift the ending, right? And like some writers don't do this. Like John Irving is famed for, he always knows the last line of his books before he starts writing, and then he writes towards that last line. But John Irving's in his own camp, right? He's like, I'm not John Irving either.
Pretty big guy,
And so once I realized that as an editor, I could just change the ending, and I realized it was about success and failure and creativity and how we put these immense pressures on ourselves, then I could finish the book. And I went through like 12 drafts of this book, and it finally started to feel more like me when it felt more like a text message exchange with a friend, because what you read is exactly how I speak. And I have to be comfortable with that. I'm like, I'm not going to sound like John Valiant or Robin Wall Kimmerer. I just sound like me, who's like a kid from Surrey who loves Wayne's World. And that's going to be in there. Yeah.
But I find that always so refreshing though. Like, I mean, you get your writers like David Foster Wallace.
Yes.
Like that guy, when he wrote, it was like you'd be reading something and then my mind would go off on a tangent, some weird like side thought that while I'm still reading something else. And then 2 lines later, he calls me out on the tangent. He's like, yeah, you were probably just daydreaming about this. And I'm like, what the fuck? How does he know? Yeah. How did you do that? But at the same time, I find his writing difficult to, like, I have to get myself into the groove of his writing to really appreciate it. I can't just like pick it up and like randomly read it. It's not doable. You need to be ready to like engage really, really, really intensely and like ask yourself questions. And that's exhausting. Yeah. So as much as I am blown away by his talent and ability to write and ability to see the world and explain it, books like yours where you weren't trying to be anything. Like it was, you were just like, this is me. This is my experience. It's very refreshing. And I think that is something in the age of social media that's been nice, in that you do get the odd, influencer or whatever person out there who realizes like, no, the way to do this life is to just be authentic. And that will allow you to see your dreams come true and see those things happen. Right. And, I appreciate that about the book, because it's clear that you're not like trying to tell anybody anything. You're like, hey, this is what I experienced. What do you think? And it's cool. It makes for an easy read, and it makes for a good thought-provoking read too, right?
Thank you. Yeah, that was definitely my intention with it. And I think we do create these like information cliques. I remember like years ago going into a bank and trying to learn about investing, and that's the worst way to learn. Is like from an investment banker. But then
they don't even know what they're doing.
They don't know what they're doing. No, they don't.
They really don't. I've never met one that knows much. Yeah.
Right. But I left feeling like, oh, like now I know less than I did. And I think that's such a terrible way to learn things. Like, we need to be supporting each other. And what was great about this project is that the tree tracking community are so welcoming and generous. And once I allowed them to help me, I could actually learn a lot more, because again, I felt like I had to know it all already before starting. And otherwise, what was the point? And would really be hard on myself for not knowing how to measure a tree from the beginning. But then why would I know how to measure a tree? Like, this is not a typical activity. And so I would content myself at first with, like when my first tree I go see, I bring a tennis ball for scale, and then I just take a photo, and I'm like, someone will tell me if this is the right tree. I'm like, I think it's the right tree. And it looks pretty big. And my boyfriend at the time, he termed like it's the Lewis assessment of bigness. Like it's a qualitative assessment. Yeah, the Lewis qualitative assessment of bigness is like, this tree is big, that tree not so much. And I was that's kind of all I have capacity for. And now I realize that I can learn to measure a tree. Like, it's not that complicated. And it's like anything, like as I say in the book, easy is what you know how to do. And but we all feel like we have to prove ourselves by our knowledge, and that our knowledge, we know this much and you don't know that much. And it's just a silly way to be, because you could just teach each other.
Yeah. Oh no, totally. Yeah, absolutely. And it's I find it especially interesting in professional circles as well, right? Because like obviously if you're a professional in some aspect, whether it's particle physics or tree physiology or whatever it might be, you know a lot about that very specific thing, but you may not know a lot if you're tree physiologist. You might not know a lot about soil structure or carbon accounting, or you might not know a lot about habitat and so being able to, like, we live in the age of specialization, and being able to open up and not have an ego about what you know, and being able to learn new things and listen to people who have different perspectives, it just rounds you out so much better, and just allows you to think about these big topics, like how do you manage a landscape that has 8 billion people on it, right?
Yeah.
Like in a sustainable way. Like, I don't know. We're still figuring that out. We have no idea. We're just like kind of chugging along. Like, I think we'll do this now. Wait, that didn't work. Let's try something else. And it's like, it's this challenge, because like we want people to be okay. We want people to thrive. I don't think there's no politicians out there saying we should have like a black dot policy or anything like that. You know what I mean? Like
what's a black dot policy?
That's that, like, I think it's from one of those, the pirate stories where like, they hand out pieces of paper, and if you get the black dot, you're the one that walks the plank kind of thing. So like, no, I don't think anyone's saying that, we need to like kill half the population so we can be sustainable on the planet. No, we're trying to figure it out with what we got.
Yeah.
And so, it's a challenging thing. And, but I think sometimes it comes down to a simple fact of just like, hey, rare things should be protected. Like, I think that's a bet we can hedge pretty safely, Yep.
Yeah. But sadly is not totally the case, at least in BC. And the thing about the registry, the common misconception with the registry is that once you put a tree on the registry, boom, it's protected and it can't be cut down. And that's not the case at all. Like, I could have a big, like I'm looking at a big Douglas fir right now, and I could just go cut that down if I wanted to, because it's on my property and it's not protected. And even if I had put it in the registry. And so some of these trees grow on private lands and some grow on parklands, and the ones that are in parklands are technically protected, but some grow in woodlots and could be harvested. Western Forest Products is a timber company out here in the province, in BC, and they are doing a good job of working with the BC Big Tree Registry to actually find and nominate a lot of these trees. And like, I think they've nominated well over 100 trees, and they will retain them when they're in certain sizes. But that's the thing again about if you're only quantifying a tree, is that there's different sizes based on the species of tree. So like, some trees just have to, they will get that big before they can be harvested. But if you leave most trees, they will become big. And so the tall trees
at
right
least
now,
bigger anyways.
They will become bigger, or in their context, like a Sitka alder can be big, but not that big. But the tallest trees right now, they might not be retained based on those size limits. But if you give them a few years, they will girth out and become big, and then they would have been protected. And that's the thing, is that we're cutting down things without giving them the chance to become rare. And I think that's the real tragedy of forestry on the coast, is that we have logged out a lot of these big, big trees thinking that it is a renewable resource. But those trees that are cut down and harvested, like, you can cut down a forest and replant it and then harvest it again. And that's one way to manage a forest. But if you're cutting down these trees when they're only 40 years old, you're never going to achieve an old growth forest again. So are we replanting to cut, or are we replanting to make this older landscape?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think that's where we're at this intersection in time, right?
Mm-hmm.
Where, like I said, we're trying to figure out what sustainability means. And it's beyond sustained yield, right? We have to be, it's not just about, it's not sustainable if we're degrading the landscape, period, right? Like the whole point is that all of these values need to be sustainable over time. And there's one gentleman that I have on quite regularly. I've had him on like 3 or 4 times, Milo Mihalovic, and we had a big conversation about values, right? And how forestry, for a long time, and it was basically just like sustained yield with constraints, right?
Mm-hmm.
So we constrained based off, okay, you can't be too close to the watershed, you can't be too close to an eagle nest, you can't be too close to the the salt lick, you can't be too close to this, and we'll just put buffers. And so it's sustained yield management while we constrain these other values so that we don't affect them, right?
Yeah.
And we assumed that was enough, and it's moved on now to something where people are starting to think, okay, maybe we should stop assuming that that's enough. And now we need to start looking into how do we actually not just avoid wrecking those values, but how do we actually improve those values on the landscape while removing timber, right?
Yeah.
And I think that's the kind of the new forestry, the new way of thinking. I don't know how long it takes for like, again, I'm not a coastal forester. I can't speak to the methodology or anything. I can speak to Alberta. Like, I understand that ecology, but there I can't speak to it. So I won't pretend to know. But I know that, I'm sure you've read Gary Merkel and the other gentleman's The Old Growth Report. I forget what it's called.
Strategic Review.
Yes, that one. The Strategic Review. Yeah, I've had Gary on a couple times. Yeah, and he talks about all of these things, right? And this balance and the need for a tiered system of management. And it all came down to just like rethinking how we approach this, right?
That's
and just
it.
like,
yeah,
just we need to be in a different mindset when we make these decisions, and we can't be making assumptions on values. We need to be measuring values and making decisions based off that quantification, right? There's still a long way to go, I think, in a lot of places, but I think people are trying.
I think they really are. And I think in many ways, like in general, I feel like we're in this messy middle that was accentuated by the pandemic. We realized, that we're disconnected. There's this epidemic of loneliness, and technology. Is it good or bad? Like neither, right? Yeah. It's just, we have values that we apply to it. And the same is true of the forest. And what I like about Gary Merkel and that report is it really calls for a paradigm shift. And it's just like, here's where we are. These things are working. These things, not so much. These things we don't know yet. And a tree, as I say in the book, like a tree is what you make of it. And it's either big or it's small, or it's a bush or it's a tree, or it's timber or it's not. And it really is, the forest is just like, the forest is a forest. It's nothing but that, but we apply values to it. And as you said earlier, like it can be a symbol of our greed, or it can hold our guilt, or it can hold our deepest hopes. Like, like I really love gardening, and what I love about gardening is it's such a manifestation of hope, right? There's so much contained in a seed, and you're like, I'm just going to create the conditions for growth, and I'm going to let you flourish, and we'll see what happens. But I think with forestry these days, I would love us to just stop, like just pause. And like Bill McKibben, who's a fellow writer and environmentalist, he has this great saying. He's like, when you realize you're in a hole, stop digging. Right? Like that's just it. Like you just pause and be like, is this working? It's like a conflict, like in a relationship, like, okay, what's happening here? And so if we look at how forestry has evolved, I think there's a lot of promise in that. And I've been in tons of forests that have been denuded, and they were cut down to the creek. And those forests, they lose something, and they still have this magic to them. And you can look at that and be like, wow, that was so short-sighted. Like, why did they cut down to the creek? Well, because that made sense at the time. Like, why wouldn't you cut those trees? They grow so big along the creek.
Yeah, they do grow nice. Yeah.
Yeah. And so now in 30 years, people will look at the forestry today and be like, why did they do that way?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. And so all we can do is just, I think, learn from the past. And if you think about like Easter Island, right? Like, why did that civilization collapse? Probably because they cut down the trees. Or Ireland. We think about Ireland as being these rolling hills, like this green, like this emerald green landscape. But Ireland wasn't always like that. Ireland was forested. Ireland has been mostly deforested for agricultural reasons because we put a value on agriculture over forestry at that time, and also for colonial reasons, right? So the Brits or the British people came over and cut down a lot of the timber and took it for timbers and housing, and that was a decision. And now there's a decision to rewild some of Ireland. And like we can make those decisions in our creative lives, in our daily lives, and in our forestry practices.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And the coastal BC is a very unique forestry situation, right? It's got a lot of things going on that aren't going on anywhere else. And it's not what's true there is not true elsewhere in the country, right? So it's very unique, and those outside of it can't really speak to it. Like, I can't really speak to what's going on, but I can trust people like Gary Merkel to understand it, right? And I do, right? And which is why I've had him on, I think 3 times, because it was a very well balanced and well thought out and nuanced perspective, and just a brilliant mind, right? So, and I think that's why I wanted to have you on regarding these big trees, and because they are this totem, and they do hold this kind of hope and this guilt and this value to people that may never ever see them, but they know that they exist, and that gives them some kind of I don't know, hopeful feeling, magical, with spiritual connection to the forest, knowing that Hyperion is a real tree that's however old it is. I don't know how old it is, but it's 100 meters tall or whatever. And it's just this enormous whale of a tree that lives currently. And that harkens back to an age before settlers were here and before things were the way they were. And that tells a story without a doubt. Yeah. And it's something that I thought was interesting too, that I meant to bring up earlier, but it's just kind of a small side note. But like you mentioned, old trees are not necessarily big trees, and big trees aren't necessarily old trees, right? And I think about that, like some of the oldest trees, well, I would say, most of the oldest trees in Alberta, for example, the ones that are, 400 or 500 years old, they're at the top of the mountain or in the middle of a muskeg, in the middle of a black spruce bog, right? And they're this 6 or 7 or 10 meter tall black spruce tree that's 400 or 500 years old and just looks gnarly as hell, but is still kicking it, right? Like, it's like, so there's, I mean, that's never at risk of being harvested because it's just not that, but it has a huge amount of value in that you're like, hey, this is a landscape that has in the boreal, the main disturbance is burning, right? And it hasn't been completely 100% burnt in 400 or 500 years. What does that mean for the undergrowth? What kind of plants grow here that don't grow elsewhere? What kind of ecology? What's the system? Must be different than the 100-year-old stand, right?
Yeah.
And that has a huge amount of value in it's not just big trees in my mind, right? It's just things that are rare in this day and age, things that are hard to get back, right? They're important to point them out and to make them some kind of totem, I think, for the public, so that even though that might be putting them at risk, like you mentioned, right? I think it's important in this day and age when we have 8 billion people on the planet, and we need to start making decisions on what's important to us. And in order to do that, we need people to at least know what exists, right?
Yeah,
so
that's right.
Yeah. Yeah. I appreciate this exploration into big trees and into your emotional connection to them and your personal experience with learning about ecology. And it is clear that you developed a much deeper connection to the forest around you. as opposed to seeing the trees only, right? And being at awe with the trees. Now it was clear that you're looking down as well, and you're appreciating the forbs and the shrubs and the mosses that exist and the fungi and just like appreciating the interconnections. And that's such a deeper appreciation than just going like, damn, that's a big tree. That's really cool.
Yeah. And I've come a long way from kicking myself for not knowing, like not being able to tell a hemlock apart from a Sitka spruce, apart from a Douglas fir. And at a certain age, they all kind of look the same. And then there's all these minute differences between the needles. And I'm better at it now. But like when I was on that hike on the weekend, I was just like, this type of lichen is this, and this does this, and this, and my boyfriend was like, you really know a lot about the forest. I was like, yeah, like when you start to pay attention to everything, like these things reveal themselves, and that is, I think that's just a lovely way to live. And I went on a walking tour of Stanley Park a couple of weeks ago, and for listeners who are outside of Vancouver, so Stanley Park is like Central Park in Vancouver. It's this jewel of Vancouver, and it's I can't remember how many acres, but hundreds of acres of forest. And one of my friends, Colin Spratt, has this walking tour called Ancient Trees of Vancouver, and he took us on this tour of the trees, and I learned so much about trees and how trees, like, he's like, do you know how a tree grows? I was like, no, I don't actually know how a tree grows. And when I just became a student again and didn't kick myself for not knowing, I learned a ton about trees. And that's what's been exciting about where I live now. So I did leave Vancouver during the pandemic, novel idea. I think I was the only one to leave the city to go to a small community.
You're going to travel during the pandemic?
Yeah. I'm going to leave it all behind and use the internet. So I live on this island called Gabriola Island in Nunavut territory, and it's right off the coast of Nanaimo on Vancouver Island. And the thing about the east coast of Vancouver Island and the Gulf Islands where I am is they're in this rain shadow, and they're very, very dry landscapes. And they have, even though it's just like 2 hours from Vancouver, it's a totally unique ecosystem, or a totally distinct ecosystem from the really damp coastal forests that I'm so used to, and used to just like rain rolling in over the mountains. But here it's just really, really damp. The trees are smaller, and it's technically a Douglas fir zone. So there's lots of Douglas fir, and there's Gary oak and arbutus and cedar. But the trees are really small, partially because of that landscape, like the reduced rainfall and all of that, but also because this island was mostly forested. And like the trees were cut down in the first half of the 20th century. So there are big stumps around. But what's unique about this island, I feel, is that it is very forested now. Like it's reforested, and there's just a lot of trees, and it has its own Big Tree Registry. The Gabriola Big Tree Registry. None of the trees.
Did you start it?
No, not at all. No, none of the trees that appear on that registry are on the BC Big Tree Registry, as far as I know. But it's like, that's the thing about these registries, is it's all context, right? Like these trees are smaller, but they're big in this context. And it's a very forested island, but the trees are all really small. Like they haven't achieved that same size that they did. So I find it really fascinating. Like this is the thing about looking at something based on size, is it like turns your brain inside out a lot of the time.
Oh, big time.
Big time. So like looking at a huge tree, you're like, wow, this tree, like, it's like, the cartoon character with your eyes going, ga-boom, like this tree is like 1,000 years old, or a big lonely Doug. Greg and some students just cored it this week. So they took a core sample, and they determined that it's 932 years old. And it's like, what? That is so many years, but also
that's a lot of years.
Like it's so old, but also not that old compared to like this yellow cedar. Like, and then it becomes ridiculous, right? Like, like, of course it's big and old, and anyway, it's just the funny part of this project.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think the recognition that forests are not static, right? That they are forests themselves, not just individual trees, but forests themselves are for lack of a better word, they're their own organism, right? Like they're constantly changing. There's constantly disturbance. There's constantly things changing, and it's not like every tree has the potential to reach 900 years old, right? Like that's just not going to be the case. But I think from what I gather, a lot of the back and forth about like, okay, how much should be old growth, like coastal old growth, and how much should be mature growth, and how much should be younger, and like what is that landscape supposed to, what is the ideal landscape, right? Like if we're going to design a landscape from scratch, we're God. I'm going to build the perfect ecological balance with indigenous people on it that know how to do their own stewardship and manage for themselves and provide back to the landscape, and that's what we're going to do. What does that look like? And that's what I think, that's where a lot of the discussion and argument is right now, right? Is that there's people that have a certain set of skills, a certain set of knowledge, and they're saying this is what I think. And then there's other people saying, well, this is what I think, and they have a different perspective and we're trying to put these two together in a way, right? We're trying to be like, okay, how do these fit, right? And what is the truth? And we don't know. And but we do know that we've harvested a whole shit pile of really, really old, really, really big trees, and we know that. So we could use that as a starting point. It was fascinating to explore that thought process, right? From someone who doesn't have a historical Western education on forest and forest ecology, right? And to watch you develop that understanding of ecology and the lack of a static nature of this being, that it is like half the trees that you went to see, half the champions you found, you showed up and you're like, well, this tree is almost dead, or this tree doesn't exist. It is dead. It fell over. And this one is, and so that was an interesting point to make, right? Like these things are changing and they are really old, and that's great, but they will die eventually, whether it's from natural causes or climate change or whatever. But, the only way we continue to have this is by keeping this in our mind and managing for it for generations to come, right? So it's and managing the trees for what they are, because not all trees are designed to live until they're 900. Like some trees just have an 80-year life cycle. Like balsam fir around here, it doesn't live that long, and it tends to rot from the top. So it's like kind of a problem tree, or like an alder. Alders spring up everywhere, but they don't live that long. And so if we think about all trees, they should be big and they should be old. And it's like, no, they don't. Like trees can just be trees. Or Pando, for example, right? I think Pando is an excellent example of that. And it's so, it's like, I guess I should explain it for just in case folks don't know. But Pando is it's on the list for one of the top 2 biggest organisms on the planet, and no one really knows for sure if it's that one or this fungus that I think exists somewhere, but it's like a moss feature or something. And what Pando is it's this collection. It's an aspen clone, a trembling aspen clone with, I think there's tens of thousands of trees in it, and it's been carbon dated. The root system has been carbon dated to be 80,000 years old, and that's significant because that's how aspen clones they exist. I know you know this, but they exist in a way that is the trees can die. They're like the fruiting body of the fungus, right? The mushroom can pop up and die, but the actual organism is underground, right? The rooting system exists. So the genetics are the same. So they're saying that organism, that aspen clone, could be, what was it, like 80,000 years or something old?
I can't remember the figure, but it's something mind-boggling.
Yeah, like it didn't have glaciation, so it's been around for so long. And like that is, to the unassuming eye, if someone's just to walk through that, they would just assume, look at this like tiny patch of, like 18-meter tall, scraggly looking aspen trees. And they wouldn't, if you didn't know the ecology, if you didn't know the backstory, if you didn't know the succession of the forest and how it works, you might not appreciate that. Listen, this is probably the oldest thing on the planet that's alive. And you're like, damn, that's something else, right?
Yeah.
I can't remember the exact, maybe it was 40,000. I can't remember. It's tens of thousands of years old.
It's incredibly old. Yeah.
And that has an incredible amount of value, regardless of the fact that it's not a big tree, right? And
it's not timber that we want to harvest, right? Like I think each distinct tree is not that big or special. it's special because it's connected.
Yeah. What I came away with in the book was it's important to be inclusive of all these values and all these thought processes, and to not be assuming of things before we cast judgment or build our own perspective on it. We're going to set in stone and, etch into the, it was a refreshing book to get those kind of thoughts. And it's nice for me to step outside of the science of it and to step inside the emotion of it for a little while and kind of go, yeah, you're right. That is why I like trees, because they make me feel good, right? Like in the end of the day, trees make me feel good. And that's why I do this. So that matters. Yeah.
But I should also say that trees didn't always make me feel good. Like without giving much away, like the opening line of the book is these fucking trees, right? Because I couldn't find the trees, and that needed to shift, right? Because if you go after something hating it, like again, you're not going to find it, and it's just going to make you miserable. But you said about thinking about these trees, like it's kind of calming. And that once I found this tree that I'd been looking for in that opening chapter, it's a Western hemlock, and it grows up on a mountain in the North Shore. And took me 3 tries to find it. And I was really relieved when I found it. But then when I was lying in bed that night, I could think about it growing up there, and just like all the little critters moving around it, and it's like swaying softly in the breeze. And I thought, this is like deeply calming, and I am part of this world, and that tree is also part of this world. And isn't that like a lovely thing, is that we can change our relationship to the forest, and we might have cut it down a certain way before, but it's never too late to change something, to change a practice that isn't working.
Yeah. I think I want to leave it at that.
Okay.
You summed it up nicely. You just put it together.
All right. Thanks, Matt.
Yeah. Well, thanks so much, Amanda, for coming on. Like I really appreciated the clear amount of effort and time and caution you took with how you were putting this together, right? Like, and it was a fun read, and it helped me to see a different way as well. So awesome. Thanks for coming on and for sharing your story with us.
Hey, it's my pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for listening. I hope you enjoyed that. Isn't Amanda awesome? Right? Her book reads just like she talks. Just funny and honest and transparent. I loved it. It was so good. So well thought out. I definitely recommend you go out and buy the book, Tracking Giants by Amanda Lewis. It's great. Yeah. Thanks so much for listening. If you like this episode, rate and review it. Share it on social media. Push this episode online wherever you're at, especially if you got a big following. I need the help, man. I suck at this social media thing. I just do. I'm just not good at it. So help me. That'd be great. Thank you. Appreciate it. We'll catch you next time. Take it easy.